Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is a scenario I haven't touched on in about a year, and that's because this is the last year's 4th of July special. What if the United States formed an empire? And today we're going to be returning that scenario. So if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and let's get into it. So when we left off, the United States just got into war with all of NATO, Russia, Belarus, which is not really that important, China, and North Korea. And it kind of lost, and its borders got shrunk. But here's the thing, its borders got shrunk. It lost a lot of land, good land, but it's militarily wise, it's not that limited. So, when Russia, Belarus, China, and North Korea then turn their focus from the United States to NATO and start invading into the Baltics, basically declaring war on NATO, while also moving through Ukraine, the United States is actually going to take this chance to rejoin the war, starting out on the side of its former enemies, Russia and China. So here's what's going to happen. US is going to start off going into states such as Washington, Idaho, Montana. We're also going to send forces through Michigan, if that is Michigan. And what they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and surround the entirety of the Great Lakes, basically taking almost 100% control of them. Obviously, they no longer have naval superiority due to the fact that their navy is kinda weakened. However, they are still going to use this chance to take over the Great Lakes. Then from here, they're going to start moving up north and moving up towards Ontario, which is somewhere in this area. I don't know where it's at, but the United States, despite having a extremely weakened military, will capture it. All this area over here will fall over to the Americans pretty quickly. The shock of the United States, however, Mexico is going to go ahead and actually join this war. Now, the United States was actually planning to invade Mexico either way, so the United States isn't that, whoa, no, it's such a bad thing. So what's going to happen is they're going to send their forces down into California and Baja California, retaking the peninsula that they used to rule over. They also go into Louisiana and the parts of Texas that they have unfortunately lost, going ahead and liberating them and bringing them back under American rule. And from here, you've seen the scenario enough times to know what exactly is going to happen. The United States will snake down the coastlines of Mexico. Mexico, despite having gained some pretty valuable land, is still kinda weak against the United States. And obviously, this isn't like peak United States, but they're still pretty strong for the time. So they're gonna go through, they're gonna do something similar to what they have done in the past. A landing in Yucatan is made, however, it's not as big as was hoped, as obviously the United States is weakened, they're not as strong, and therefore they can't push into Mexico as much as they want. But still, this is enough, and by this point, Mexico City has been captured, and Mexico will go ahead and surrender over to the United States. Meanwhile, invasions onto Vancouver Island and into British Columbia begin to unfold as Russia does something interesting. They land in Alaska and begin to actually take the area, and this comes to a major shock to a bunch of countries until they investigate into it a little bit more. And here's what they discover. They discover that what actually happened is Russia and China sent boats into North Korea, and they sailed these boats from North Korea, but instead of landing in like Vancouver and stuff, by this point these areas were already occupied by the US, so instead they traveled up north into Alaska and framed it so it looked like, hey, we're invading through Siberia. Oh, we're so strong. Unfortunately, they are not, and pretty quickly Canadian forces will arrive and push the Russians back a little bit up north in Alaska. Our rate is not enough, as looking at the European front line, it's not looking the greatest for NATO. However, they do have a little bit of invaded area up north in Finland, which I might actually go ahead and change real quick. Yeah, that looks better. So they have some invaded land up north in Finland. For the most part, the Russians and Chinese are dominating in Europe. And by this point, the United States is just focused on, for the second time in history, taking out the Canadians. They have done this in the past, but obviously when that happened, they were with all of NATO, they were with all of Russia. However, at this very moment, Russia is basically their ally, or de facto ally. So they're going to snake up the coast, retaking what land that they used to own up north in Alaska before having to bring troops more south due to the fact it's so cold up here. It's going to be hard to occupy. But looking at the map, areas that many Canadians inhabit are currently falling over to the Americans as they reach up north, capture this lake up north, if that is a lake. They also meet the Hudson Bay, taking an island in the middle of it. They take some more coastline, and from here the Canadian government on the mainland of Canada will go ahead and surrender. However, they will remain on a few islands. Some of these islands do get occupied by the Americans, but for now, America's gonna have to start island hopping once more throughout Canada, as they once did to Japan a little while ago. From here, the United States will quickly find that some of these states down here, not states, the island nations down here, are actually siding with people, and they're siding with NATO, and that's actually because when Russia and China declared war on NATO, they weren't declaring war on just NATO, they were declaring war on every single country that they had previously just been fighting with them and the USA. Every country other than, so every country that in the last video was blue during the entire USA coalition, all those countries that were blue are now blue once more because Russia and China are declaring war on them, which by this point they're going to start expanding their influence. When I say influence, I don't mean like influence, I mean like they're going to declare war on some more countries, and these countries are going to be South Korea and Japan, and to the shock of a bunch of people around the world who didn't expect the United States to actually care about their allies, the allies they used to have before this crazy war thing happened. They went imperialist, which they're still imperialist. This is why this is happening again. But everyone thought that the U.S. didn't care about their islands, and they're gonna quickly find that not to be. I don't know why I said islands. I meant allies. They're gonna quickly find that the USA, they still care about their allies. So when South Korea and Japan get declared war on, the United States will send forces into, I almost said Canada, California. I don't know why I'm so, uh, really, you know what I mean. So they go ahead and they occupy California, and they also go south, they occupy Florida, and now the United States is at war with the Purple Alliance. And one of the first things they're going to do is working to liberate the rest of Alaska. They will do so successfully. However, from here, they're going to move their forces back down south because they know what's about to happen. South Korea is quick to fall and Japan starts to get invaded. However, they only lose their northern island as American reinforcements arrive. USA will then, was that really necessary? Oh my gosh, of course. So the US goes down, they occupy some of their former states, and now the United States is finding itself to be just a little bit bigger. So let's see what happens from here. The American forces up north, island hopping from Canadian island to Canadian island. They're gonna start to slow down, and eventually they're gonna meet with any person in these areas. If there are any, more than likely there aren't. And that's basically what's gonna lead to the following event. As the rest of Canada, the islands that didn't surrender to the USA when mainland Canada surrendered to the USA, everywhere else in Canada is finally going to surrender, meaning the United States has once again majority control over North America. Obviously, there's Central America, but they aren't looking over there as of right now. As of right now, they are looking towards the east where they have a battle to fight. So China's going to take its military. They are going to start moving down south. And what in the world? The United States invades and occupies Taiwan because China, most of their military was up here. Not their military, their navy was mostly up here in these Japanese islands. They didn't expect the Americans to have such a good navy because, they just lost that insane war. But now the US has naval dominance, kind of, because they just took Taiwan. Meaning, the US now has a better staging ground to invade China than it did before, meaning that invading Japan is going to be a little bit harder, and even worse, it means your greatest enemy is again at your doorsteps. Before, you were at their doorsteps, literally you had California over here, but now you don't. Now California is occupied by America. You know what else is occupied by America? Happens to be Cuba, as Cuba falls over to the Americans. USA will then land some few areas in the south of Greenland, and after you take the south of Greenland, there's literally basically no one else in Greenland, so it'll basically surrender over. And the US will actually go ahead, they will sit down with Iceland, they will say, hey, if you don't try and help everyone else land in over here on Greenland, we won't invade you. And Iceland will agree to this deal, which means if all the NATO countries want to come over here and liberate Greenland, they're gonna have to try a little bit harder now. Back to the Eastern Theater, we see Georgia ends up joining the war. And this is mostly because Georgia and Russia have they have really big tensions. So obviously Georgia has like the breakaway states that are somewhere over here in these areas, and that's basically the entire point of Georgia joining the war. So they will join the war and they will start to push back in these areas, only for the Russians to pull an Uno reverse and instead start invading the Georgians, not just from these little breakaway areas, but also just straight up like, hey, hippity hoppity, your land is now my property. And suddenly Turkey's a little bit panicked because now not only are they having to supply over in their west, they're also now having to supply in their east. And that's going to be a little bit of a thorn in Turkey's side. So Turkey is a little bit stressed right now, but certainly not as stressed as Finland, who has unfortunately lost all invaded land and instead are having land invaded. Along with this, Norway loses a little bit of they're more like, not just like a little bit, they have a lot of their easternmost region being occupied by the Russians as the Russians finally start to push into Finland. This is, for a long time in history, been a thorn in the Russian side. The Russians have tried a few times to invade the Finnish. A few times they have failed, a few times they've succeeded. This time they will be maybe succeeding. Right now they're succeeding. They could fail in the future though, but we'll have to see. Transnistria over here in Moldova will declare that, hey, we're siding with Russia and stuff like that, and then Moldova's just gonna join the war because technically what happens is that Transnistria, they go ahead and they start invading these areas, which means Moldova is like, yo, you can't do that. And Moldova's like, I'm not Moldova, Transnistria is like, oh yeah, we can because we're independent. Moldova's like, well, we're gonna make you not independent, so they're gonna go ahead, they're gonna declare on Transnistria. What the heck? And they're gonna go ahead and quickly squash this small rebellion. But unfortunately, that small thing was just what Russia needed to distract Ukraine and push them back a little bit further. Unfortunately for Europe, without the USA, Russia and China are just too big of a threat. But fortunately for them, the USA is also kind of now on their side, as they no longer have ambitions in Europe. They never did. They were mostly focused on North America during their insane conquest a little earlier. So here's what's going to happen. They're going to go over to China and they're going to say a few things. They're going to say Macau is mine, Hong Kong, wherever it is mine. The Koreas are going to be mine. Japan is going to be mine. Beijing is going to be mine. You will be mine. America basically says, stop or else you will become extremely American. And China doesn't like being extremely American. So they finally gain naval superiority around Japan and finally start invading it, going in, taking Tokyo, and then from here there's the Japan is not just probably, it will be falling over to the Chinese. So now China has South Korea and Japan. These are some pretty good nations. So China thinks they're back on top again. They're like, woo, yeah, we're better. Because after the USA fell, China became number one because they annexed California from the USA. Russia did not gain anything. China, who did a lot more of the work, gained a few other things. But here's the issue with China. As of right now, all their forces aren't over here in China or anywhere else. They're over here in Europe. They're fighting on the front lines, trying to take out Finland, trying to take out Poland, Ukraine, Georgia. They're all over this way. They are not down this way. So the Chinese will be expecting a naval invasion of Japan, but what they don't expect is an air invasion. So the USA will actually take some paratroopers and they will go above Tokyo and they will land paratroopers in Tokyo. And after a few more sets come in, they will take the rest of the city. This isn't really much as they're occupying Japan, more like they're liberating it, but for the time being, we're going to show that the USA is actually just occupying it because the Japanese government officials, they're probably somewhere in China being held captive. More than likely, they will be sentenced to life in prison or death or something like that. So the USA is having to occupy what basically does not exist anymore. So that's what that's all about. Anyways, China will now focus their other stuff on the air. So they try to kick the Americans out over here in Japan. I don't know why. Oh my gosh, I don't know why I keep on forgetting these things and misspeaking these words. So that's my bad, chat. Alright, guys. With a few less people to worry about on the front lines here in Europe, the Europeans are actually able to successfully push back a little bit, but not too much, but they do push back a little bit. They also start a campaign that goes up. They liberate Kiev from Russian control, and also a small campaign to liberate Georgia does begin. It's not too successful, though this is pretty mountainous region. But at least there is some attempt. And the USA will then do something that will shock basically a bunch of countries, but more specifically of all, I think that the purple team will hate this all the most. The United States is going to go to these NATO countries and they're going to be like, hey, we just want to fight the Russians and the Chinese because they don't want to sit down for peace with us. But we are willing to peace out with you. And basically what happens is the United States, they go over to NATO and they're like, yo, I want to make a peace treaty with you. And NATO is actually going to go ahead and accept this peace treaty because the British have been trying to land in Greenland. The French have been trying to land in Canada, as have Spain and Portugal. They've all failed. But now the country that is like mostly your main focus because they just went imperialist, you just had an entire coalition against them, but they don't want to fight you. And they were like, hey, maybe all they wanted was Canada and Greenland. Now they don't regret that whole coalition thing, but seeing as they need as many people over here as possible, they will actually go ahead and sit down with the USA and they will sign a peace treaty. And basically what the treaty is that all of this becomes American. So the US technically will own all this land. However, I'm going to keep the border due to the fact that, you know, I'm probably going to forget. Plus, like, the Russians could come in and quote unquote liberate it. So, but for now, they technically do control this land. However, until the war against the Russians and the Chinese ends, the borders will remain. Which also means that technically the United States is now helping out NATO. The alliance that just formed a coalition against the United States is now relying on the United States to take out China, and the United States is going to gladly do so as some Chinese people wake up one morning, and the United States seem to have landed in China. Overnight, the US gained naval superiority after gaining air superiority, and this area then showing like increased naval activity and then attacking a few Chinese ships. And when I say a few, I mean like a lot. So China had to pull out some navy over here, which the US used for their actual plan, which was to invade over here into China. And this goes successfully. They land paratroopers first, and then they land actual boats and people and stuff like that. So now China has a little issue on their southern front. They lose this island right here that I don't know the name of. And now they're panicking, so they're going to send naval forces down south, and this is exactly what the US is hoping. As they go through, they attack the Chinese, and if we look at a battle map of what happens here, the Chinese Navy, despite having a lot more boats, unfortunately does not have the readiness to fight the Americans. They are not strategic enough. They're not preparing for an invasion like this. As they're like scrambling around, they don't know what's going on. Everything's so confusing. And eventually they are going to get pushed back, which leads to more naval landings in Japan being made until eventually they all combine into what is basically one front, excluding the one island that the US has liberated. From here, some more islands will be liberated, and by this point, the purple team should probably accept their defeat. China, however, is refusing to surrender, and this is going to kind of become a problem when the US eventually lands in South Korea. And they start to push through the Korean Peninsula. However, the Chinese are able to put people down here, able to stalemate it. Will they be able to push back? Unfortunately, no one will ever know because North Korea will actually surrender over to the USA. Then Russia will basically say, hey, let's peace out, which is followed by Belarus, obviously. Obviously, they're going to still fight with their NATO, but the USA will come out and say, we're not going to take any peace treaties unless you have NATO sit down with us. So, unfortunately, NATO will also be at this peace treaty to the unfortunateness of Russia, and eventually China will be the last country, and they will join on this peace treaty. So let's see what this peace treaty looks like. Alright, so for starters, the United States, part of the peace treaty, they basically obtain all that they wanted. They annexed more of Mexico than they did the first time they went imperialistic. They regain all of Canada up in their north area. They get Greenland. They get basically all the Caribbean. They get Yucatan. And Mexico becomes a puppet state to the United States. The US will also annex Taiwan. However, South Korea will become a puppet state, and Japan will be returned to how it was before. China will regain all the lands the US invaded, otherwise will remain untouched. Same with North Korea, and same with Russia and Belarus. Now, as for the rest of the peace treaty, it looks something like this. As Russia annexes the Baltic states, hooking up with their enclave in Kaliningrad, we also see them annex a lot of Ukraine and also South Ossetia and Abkhazia, or whatever it's pronounced like. Those two get independence, and unfortunately, that is where I'm going to leave it off. Basically, what happened was US beat China and Russia, but Russia and China beat NATO, but the US beat NATO, but the US helped NATO. Mostly this was a really complicated war scenario, so I'm sorry that it was mostly just about this war. Instead of some other things, such as like, oh, what did the USA do afterwards? Like, would they get colonies in like Africa and stuff like that? And for that, I guess you'll just have to wait and see for the next video. Next video isn't next special because these What If the USA Formed an Empire videos are only going to happen on 4th of July. It may make it a series. So, like the video if you think that's a good idea, or don't if you don't think that's a good idea. Yeah, that's basically it. I don't think there's anything else to mention. Oh yeah, next video is either going to be a short film or another mapping video about this online world map that I found a little while ago. More than likely, it will be a short film. I will be actually working on the script after recording this video, which, by the way, it is 7. I meant 11:34 p.m. It is almost midnight. Not really, but yeah. Probably gonna start working on the script for that. So, anyways, this has been What If the United States of America Formed an Empire, and I will be seeing you all in the next video. Or the next special, depends on which one you watch. So I'll see you then. Peace, and gotta get the perfect ending frame shot. There we go. Peace. See ya.